So, hello everyone. I'm Marieke van Vught. So I'll start with introducing myself. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands at the Department of Artificial Intelligence. I got my PhD in neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania. And then I did some postdoctoral research at Princeton before coming here. And my main research involves studying how the brain makes decisions. But I also am involved in some meditation research. So hence, I'm giving this talk, presenting some of my own research on how meditation affects mostly cognition, and some of mostly other people's research about that. So we all know a lot about what benefits meditation has, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But I will say something about what scientific evidence there is for the benefits of meditation. So this is a very beautiful depiction, I think, of what this enterprise is about. It's about bringing together the ancient sort of science of mind that these guys, these contemplatives have been involved in for, thousands of years, and then interacting with our Western science, the science more of the outside world, but that's now with the advent of neuroscience also also psychology. Psychology and neuroscience started to focus more on the inner, also looking at the mind, but from the third person perspective. So we're all pretty familiar with this first person perspective of our own practice. But today I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we call the third person perspective. What happens when we look at these people that study their own minds with our Western tools, with our psychological tasks, with our brain scanners. Which I think is a very exciting sort of development. So I'll start with talking a little bit about the effects of meditation on cognition. So that really started out mostly in 2007. Which was very interesting. This is one study from Amishi Jha of the University of Pennsylvania, which really happened when I was running around there as well as a PhD student. So I was quite involved in that. She is an attention researcher and studied attention, and she also got quite curious about meditation. So she was like, well, let's try and see whether we can look at what happens when you put meditators through an attentional task. So this task indexes three components of attention, three main components of attention. And the first, what people do basically in this task is they look at little arrows on the screen and different combinations of arrows, and they have to say whether the arrow in the center is pointing to the left or to the right. So most of the tasks people are doing are very, very simple and very, very boring, and that's to make sure that we are controlling as much as we can, and there are not too many interfering variables. So one thing you can get out of this task is an index of how well people are at monitoring conflicting information. So if the one arrow says left and the other arrow says right, what should you do? And they basically found that when they compared meditators to control, so the meditators here are in black. Those are people who have meditated for quite a while. They are experienced people from the Shambhala Sangha in this case. When they compared them to controls and also people who were doing just an 8-week mindfulness course, MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, they found that the meditators in black had less difficulty with dealing with conflicting information. So you can see that the black bar is a little shorter than the white bar. So they have better ability to deal with this, conflict monitoring, as they call it in technical terms. The other thing that she found was that she looked at orienting, which is basically how you bring your attention to a particular stimulus on the screen. So basically in the task they would have an arrow that indicated, okay, now some information will be occurring on the left side of the screen or on the right side of the screen. And basically she found that here the benefit what occurred mostly for the MBSR people. So now the people who are doing the mindfulness-based stress reduction, if they were compared before and after they did the course, their ability to bring their attention to a particular place, that is to orient their attention in technical terms, improved. Whereas the long-term meditators, they went on an I think 1-month retreat at Datun. They didn't really improve that much on that level. They were better at the conflict monitoring, but they didn't improve over that 4 weeks on that level. So this ability to orient yourself seems to be something that is improved more in the beginning of the meditation practice, at least when done in the context of a mindfulness-based stress reduction course. So those are two components of the attentional system. The other component that may be even more sensible to think about is, of course, your ability to sustain your attention. Because, well, that's what we're trying to do when we're meditating. We're continuously trying to sustain our attention on a pretty boring stimulus, which would be our breath or, an image of Guru Rinpoche or whatever. Well, okay, sorry. Maybe that's not that boring, but still, Guru Rinpoche is not going to move, unlike most of the other things that we're looking at in our daily life. So it is still relatively boring. So, one very impressive study has been done to look at sustained attention that was part of the Shamatha project. Maybe some of you have heard about that. It was a 3-month retreat conducted by Alan Wallace in Colorado at Shambhala Mountain Center, which is actually coincidentally also where the other data came from that I just talked about. But in this case, the data, in the other case, they were from Amishi Jha. In this case, they were from the study by Alan Wallace and Cliff Saran. Alan Wallace was the Buddhist teacher and Cliff Saran was the scientist. And those people were training intensively for 8 to maybe 12 or more hours a day, mostly doing shamatha, the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And at the beginning, middle, and end of that retreat, those people were asked to do many, many tasks. I think about 3 days of testing. And one of the tasks they did, and one of the most successful publications that came out of this, at least to date, is the sustained attention task. And the task is very boring, again. So in this case, people see lines on a screen. And one of the lines, so they mostly see lines of one length, and then sometimes there is a line that's just a little bit shorter. And if they see a line that's just a little bit shorter, they have to press a button. And the scientists are very mean. They actually adjust the length of the bars such that you're just barely able to tell them apart. So it's a very, very difficult task. And if you do that for a while, people are going to decline in their performance because it's boring and it's difficult. So, what do you want? So yeah, this task can measure how well you're able to sustain your ability to detect targets, and then they have a version of the task, another version of the task that actually measures how well you're able to inhibit the responding, which is when you do simple manipulation, you tell people to press a button every single time there is a long line. But now, in the rare cases there is a short line, you should not press a button. So then, I've done a similar task like that. You're pressing buttons happily, and suddenly you have to inhibit your response. It's actually very frustrating. We had, I was involved in some study where we had people do that at Shambhala Mountain Center as well, another group of meditators, and it's people find it very annoying. I did too. Anyway, so here we look at what these people were doing at their performance. And you can basically see that normally people just decrease in their performance over time. That's what you see in the black bars. So the red arrow it says pre-training. It basically means before they started this 3-month retreat, people just got worse at detecting these very small differences between lines over time. So as you're sitting there in doing the task longer, you just get worse because it's difficult and boring. But they found out that the people after the retreats, they just kept on performing at the same time. They didn't really decline, as if they were really much better able to sustain their attention, even though this task was very boring and difficult. And actually, I think they also found that this ability remained for 3 months at least after the retreat. So they tested one cohort another 3 months after they finished their retreat to see how well the effects of meditation just persisted over time. Now, they also... Okay. They also looked at how well you're able to discriminate between lines. That was another interesting twist on the task. So that says something about how clear is your perception. How much do the lines need to differ for you to perform at a certain level, to be able to, detect some percentage of the lines, like say 70%. And they basically found that after the 3 months of retreat, people could detect much smaller differences between these lines than before, as if their sort of, quality of their attention maybe had improved. So not only their ability to maintain attention at a certain level, but also just the quality of the attention at a certain moment had improved. And then this improvement of attention was also accompanied by a specific brain response. There we go. So here we're looking at EEG activity alpha waves. Those are waves between typically 9 and 14 hertz at the back of the head, so here. They looked at these alpha waves, which also say something about how you employ your attention. And they basically found that this improvement in attentional functioning that the tasks had shown basically were accompanied by this change in alpha waves. So these alpha waves have previously been associated with just dozing off. These alpha waves, at least in the back of the head. And you can see on the left is before the retreat and the right is after the retreat. Basically, this dozing off sort of brain signature has decreased, and that's associated with the amount of attentional improvement. So it really says something about how well you're able to, keep yourself from dozing off. And they, I told you that they had a version of the task where you had to keep pressing the button and only sometimes had to inhibit that response. Well, they also found that people were better able to inhibit their response. That's basically what we see in this graph. Overall, you can see that their accuracy is improved from the lowest line is before the retreat, and then the upper two lines are in the middle and after the retreat, middle and after the retreat. You can see that they are basically better able to withhold their responses if they need to than before. Maybe they are less impulsive or something along these lines. So this is a very low level task that indicates how well you're able to control these almost automatic responses. Good. And then once we have talked a little bit about attention, the other thing you might wonder about, or basically the next thing that scientists started to tackle, was working memory. Because, attention is obviously the clearest thing that you're training when a scientist hears the instructions the meditation instructions, the scientists mostly think, okay, we're training attention. That's what's going on. But obviously, attention has implications for your memory, and especially for your working memory. The ability to keep items in mind and manipulate them and keep them in mind for a short period. So again, a study by Amishi Jha that sort of followed up on this work was a study of working memory capacity, which is basically the number of items that you can keep in your mind. So it's typically thought that you can keep about 5 items in mind, 5 numbers or 5 letters. But the number of items that you can keep in mind actually varies between people, and you can measure how many any particular person can keep in mind. So this was an interesting study that they actually did on the Marines of the U.S. Army. So those people were undergoing some training they called sort of, I think, mental fitness or mind fitness training to make it a little bit palatable to them, so they wouldn't think it's too wacky. But it really, the idea was, lots of people are coming back from war with post-traumatic stress syndrome. They really suffer a lot from negative emotions. They have no way of dealing with all their emotions and the stress they're undergoing at that time. So is there something we can do to help this? Well, maybe some form of mindfulness training. So they developed this mindfulness training specifically for the Marines in the Army, and it's been pretty successful. They're still working on doing experiments with them. And of course, there, from a scientist's perspective, it's really wonderful because you have this whole group of people that's basically undergoing the same regime, doing the same things, and you can just measure them pre and post. And so that's what they did. They measured them before and then after a period that they were preparing to be deployed in, I forgot, Iraq or Afghanistan or something. So it was a very, very stressful period for those soldiers. But, well, at least they got this mental fitness training that helped them maybe deal a little bit with those stresses. And what they found was that the people who were not in the mental fitness training, their working memory capacity actually decreased because of the stress. But for the people who did undergo the mental fitness and mindfulness training, their working memory capacity actually stayed about the same. You can see that black line is on the right figure shows the working memory capacity. And it actually goes up a little bit for those people, whereas the other people decrease. Well, actually, it's the case that, well, for the controls, the working memory stayed the same or decreased. And for the people that practiced very little, actually the working memory capacity still decreased. But for the people that practiced a lot, or a reasonable amount at least, their working memory capacity stayed about the same. So as if the mindfulness training really protected them against their working memory capacity decreasing. And it's even scaled with the this thing is very sensitive. Okay, so the amount of working memory capacity that people had at the end of the training actually scaled with the amount of time they practiced. So here is the number of hours they practiced, and that shows a significant correlation with their working memory capacity. So people that practice more got more working memory capacity. Of course, we don't know whether people with higher working memory capacity just like to practice more. That's possible, but well, at least it's suggestive. Then there's a study that I did also with Amishi Jha. Well, I was at the University of Pennsylvania, so I was working on basically this task of recognition memory. So people see a list of a few faces, shown one after the other. Then there's a short delay where you see nothing, and then there's another face. And you have to say whether that face is identical to one of the faces you had seen before. And by manipulating the identity of the faces, we can learn something about how your working memory works, and specifically how good you're able to distinguish between different faces that look quite a bit alike. I mean, it's a bit hard to tell from this screen, but if you, I can tell you that those faces, they are all slightly different, so you can make them out, but it's quite difficult. So you really need to remember them in very much detail to be able to give the right answer. So I was working with this task, and obviously I was already a Rigpa student at that time, so I was quite interested in meditation. So we decided to try and run this as part of our experiment. So I flew to Shambhala Mountain Center in Colorado several times, and went there, recruited people, and tested them before they went on their Datun, their 1 month retreat, 1 month shamatha retreat basically. And after their Datun, came back and had them do the task again. And basically, I looked at, I used quite complicated method to study what really went on. But basically, I found that people seem to be able to remember these faces with much more clarity, much more detail. So here is a figure from that paper. So one thing that I found was that if people had practiced a lot more, they had much less variable responses. So we obviously measured people's response time when they were doing this task, and we just looked at, one of the things we looked at is how variable are their responses, which gives some indication maybe how much you are mind wandering or doing other stuff, because if you're continuously on task, then why shouldn't you respond pretty much at the same time every time you do the task. And basically I found that if people have more training, they seem much better able to respond at a certain time, at a very fixed time, not too many other things going on. The other thing I found was, here we go, that we could measure the quality of the information they had encoded in their heads, which is really something like the quality of the faces, the representations of the faces they had to remember. So we took the responses on this task, we took the speed with which they responded, and we ran a computational model on it. And that gave us some index for with how much detail people could remember the faces they had to remember. And I looked at that number before and after the retreat. So on the left you see before the retreat, on the right you see after the retreat. In blue you see the control, and in red the meditators. The other way around. On blue you see the meditators, and red the controls. And basically you see that the meditators' quality of information improves after the meditation retreat, whereas for the controls, either it stays the same or it even goes down a little bit second time they have to do the task. Maybe second time they're a bit more bored with the task, which is also quite boring and difficult. Which I guess we psychologists seem to really like to do to people, to give them nasty tasks. But you just need a certain amount of data to be able to do the statistics. That's why. Good. So in short, people's quality of their working memory, both of the visual type and the non-visual type, seems to improve after, at least a substantial amount of meditation practice. Then the other thing that people have started looking at is something like grasping onto stimuli. So this is a study by Giuseppe Bagnoni, who is from Italy. At that time, he was still in the US, I think, at Emory, but now he's back in Italy. And he studied Zen meditators, and basically he had some look at words and non-words, and he looked at what's going on in their brain. Basically, this whole sort of network, that's a little bit hard to see in the slides, but it's the network that seems to be involved in sort of elaboration on stimuli that you see. And they call it the semantic processing network, and he compared words to non-words. And of course, for words, you're going to show much more mental elaboration than for non-words, because the non-words don't have any meaning and the words do. But what was the interesting part is when you looked at the activity of this network for the meditators compared to the controls. There we go. No. Okay. Basically here we see different lines for the meditators in red and the controls in blue, and you can basically see that for the most part the brain activity in the controls persists for a much longer time than for the meditators, and there have now been more reports on that. Also, for example, studies by Antoine Lutz, who was a postdoc in Richard Davidson's lab. He found a similar case with emotional stimuli. That's at this point hopefully soon being published. But basically the idea is that the brain responds to stimuli that should induce some mental elaboration or distraction, or maybe grasping, or sort of really this longer response that seems to be decreased in meditators compared to the controls. So I think that's a very, very interesting kind of finding that really gets us, maybe starts to get a little bit at this idea of our stories. How do we measure these stories that we are also familiar with? And I think for myself, at least, that's an important change that meditation could bring. And these are some studies that are starting to measure that, hopefully. And the other thing I recently did was I looked at some data from a study of depressed patients who did a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy course. And they were asked to recall or remember lists of positive, negative, and neutral words. And we did that both before and after. And the idea is that people with depression tend to focus a lot on the negative information and being unable to actually remember the positive information. So what I measured in that case was, once they were recalling a negative word, what was the probability that they would continue remembering that negative word? And the positive words, what was the probability they would continue remembering the positive words? So sort of really the stickiness of the negative or the positive. And basically I found that for the meditators, or the people who underwent the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy course, they actually increased in their tendency to keep recalling positive words, and they decreased in this tendency to keep recalling negative words. Whereas, so this on the left is the graph on the left shows the probability of staying with the positive words. On the right, you see probability of being stuck in the negative words, and the left column, the left two graphs of the left, the left two bars of the left graph are the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and on the right is the controls. And you can see that the MBCT basically increases in the probability of staying with the positive and decreases in the probability of staying with the negative. And the controls either stay the same or they even increase in their probability of just being stuck in the negative words. So those are, some indications of how meditation, either mindfulness or other meditation, affects your, emotional state, and specifically this sort of what I like to call a mental stickiness of being stuck in certain emotions or other stimuli. So then Another issue I wanted to highlight, and this is something that Rinpoche has also mentioned, I think, sometimes, but I wanted to show you the real data, which I like to do as a scientist, obviously, is effects of my meditation on the body. So this is probably the most foundational classic study done with John Kabat-Zinn and Richard Davidson. They looked at employees of a biotech company who were under severe stress, and they gave a group of them a mindfulness-based stress reduction course, which at that time was still quite new. By now, it's quite common, even in the Netherlands, also it's quite hot. It started more in the US, but now in Europe it's also taken off. But at that time it wasn't. So they took lots of measures, but one of the things they did was they took measures of the amount of antibodies people had against the flu. And they basically found that after the 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction, people had more antibodies, so their immunity system improved compared to the control group. So I thought that was very interesting because it's something that you really cannot fake. Like a lot of the psychological tasks, if you're more motivated, maybe that could explain some of the benefits. But this kind of thing, I don't think you could fake that very easily. And also they found that basically that this change in your antibodies or the change in the immunity system was correlated with a change in their brain waves, so a change in their brain. So it's not as if this is a purely physical thing. It seems to be related to this change in brains. What they were looking at is a difference in brain waves between the left and the right hemisphere. At this point, it's not quite clear what that really means, and it's not a completely well accepted scientific sort of measure. Rinpoche mentions it in the context of people with more sort of a higher score on this measure are happier. It's a measure of happiness, but that's something that some people believe, but I would say probably most scientists don't really believe. It's not completely unequivocal, but still it's interesting that the immunity system is associated with the brain this particular brain signature. So next on is again a finding from the Shamatha project, so where the people meditated for 3 months doing a lot of Shamatha, and they measured telomerase. And telomerase is some measure you can take on people's DNA, and it's been thought to be associated with aging. So as you age, the amount of telomerase you have in your DNA shortens, and it's thought that might actually be a crucial factor in your aging process. Now, what they found when they drew some blood, the PBMC means blood measure, they found that after the retreat, people's telomerase actually increased compared to the controls. So maybe it's good to meditate. Of course, we don't know how long that persists and what it really means, because even the function of telomerase is still being elucidated. But again, such a physical measure is an impressive finding, I think. And also, this increase in telomerase seemed to be associated with a psychological measure, namely the what they call perceived control. So these psychological measures, in this case, are measures that you can get from giving people questionnaires. So they are highly subjective, and I always am a little bit skeptical about these kind of questionnaire measures. But nevertheless, this one, perceived control, which is how much you feel like confident about the environment, it's the opposite of feeling completely hopeless. which is also associated with depression. So if you're, on the other hand, if you feel more in charge, you feel like you can deal with the world, then this, to the extent to which they reported, being able to, being in charge of the world, that was associated with this increase in telomerase. So it's not, again, not just a purely physical measure. It does seem to correlate with something meaningful, at least. So then, next section is changes of, effects of meditation on the brain. So probably this is about the most famous study that made it into many magazines and journals. This is a study again from Richard Davidson's lab, one that's also Rinpoche sometimes talks about. It's basically what they found when they put these electrode caps on meditators, not just Tibetans, also some Westerners, although you don't see those in the magazines. And they basically found that people who meditated for a long time, now this is 10 to 40,000 hours, they have a very high gamma activity during their meditation practice, and specifically during what you could call a Dzogchen or a Mahamudra practice. It wasn't during just normal shamatha with object, or not during Tonglen or meditation practice. It was really during this Dzogchen practice that they found this wild increase in gamma activity. So here you can see an example of some of these brain waves. Gamma means high frequency. It's typically between 28 and 90 hertz. And it almost, to me, as an EEG researcher, it almost looks like an artifact, and that's why it's so surprising. But basically, these people, that's off the scale. That's not what you would normally see. The problem is we don't really know what it means. But it has, so nevertheless, it has also been replicated at Princeton. When I was there, a colleague of mine had been involved in running that study in another group of meditators, and they found it too, but haven't published it yet. What is interesting, though, what gives us some clue as to what it might mean is this graph that's not in the original paper, but that was done by Antoine Lutz, is he asked these meditators to rate the clarity of their meditation. And so they had this, bar, they were moving back and forth to rate how clear they felt their meditation was at any particular point in time. And they basically found that the gamma activity, the amplitude of these brain waves, increased with the ratings of clarity, at least for some of the subjects. So that was a very interesting finding, I thought. And it says something about what this might mean, although obviously we'd need more experiments to check that. But So this is that famous finding, that a little bit more detail about, what that is when Rinpoche talks about it. And then also, this is another famous finding, that meditation can actually also change the structure of your brain. So this is done by Sarah Lazar of Harvard University. She looked at people who went on a 3-month Vipassana retreat, I think in Barre, Massachusetts. And she basically found that this one area in the brain, the insula, changed in size, basically. So for the meditators, this insula, whereas normally you would see that the insula, area basically decreases with age. So that's what you see in the red dots on the right going down. It decreases in its size with age, because as you age, your brain just, declines. Sad to say. But the meditation, you can see for the meditators that was no longer the case. It's just sort of the blue dots just keep on going straight. So it's as if maybe the meditation had prevented that area of that particular brain area, at least in declining. Now, that was not the case for the whole brain. So that's something that, well, we don't quite know what it means at this point, but that area has been associated with a lot of things, including sort of interoception, the ability to feel your internal state, your heart, your body. Also, something like empathy, decision making. It's actually an area that you see in a lot of cases. So in that sense, we don't really know what it means, but it's interesting that it shows this effect. We've also seen effects on brain structure of much shorter periods of retreats, up to even an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction retreat that seems to have affected the hippocampus, this memory area. But the problem there is that if it happens on an 8-week basis, then it's quite likely that it would also reverse on an 8-week basis. So how long that actually persists is not clear. The advantage of this study is that it actually shows that something that persists on a much longer time scale. And these people had all practiced quite a bit. I think also like 10,000 hours or more. And a much more recent study was done by Judd Brewer of Yale University. He studied people involved meditators and looked at their default mode network, which is something that's been thought to be involved in daydreaming, being distracted. There is this particular set of brain areas that seems to be activated, and they found that overall, in the meditators, that default network has decreased power. So I guess that's good news. They also found they looked a little bit more at how this may work, and they basically found that one reason why this default network may have less power is that specifically during the meditative state, specifically during the baseline state, the frontal cortex, so this part of the brain, here we are, the frontal cortex seems to be involved, sort of connected to the default network, so the distraction network, as you what you could call the distraction network. And they basically found that during the day, that was mostly what happened to people. Their frontal cortex was inhibiting their default mode network. But then interestingly enough, when they were meditating, that inhibition was left alone. So they basically seem to decouple their frontal cortex, which is associated with, exerting a lot of control and controlling. So they basically let go of that during their meditation, but still this distraction network did not really go up. So the distraction network still decreased. And that's good news because basically there's this famous study that Rinpoche also sometimes mentions that people that are distracted a lot are not so happy. So in this study, what they did was really cool actually. They gave people like a Palm Pilot and they beeped them many times a day and they asked them, well, what are you doing and where is your what is your focus? And they basically found that when the people that tended to report more often that they were somewhere else with their mind from what they were doing, they tended to be less happy than the people that were actually more focused on what they were doing. So daydreaming seems to be not such a great thing, according to this study. So then that brings us to the end, I think, of or almost the end of my story. I wanted to say just a tiny little bit about compassion, because here in Rigpa we also do a lot of compassion. That was even in the all-encompassing path recently. The compassion came up. So what benefits does that have? They've also just started to study this, and here they are comparing people who are very altruistic on the right to people who are not so altruistic on the left. And they looked at, basically, they followed a large number of people over time, and they looked at how long they survived, basically, or in other words, when they died. And they compared people in low and high stress conditions. So within the two graphs, the two lines indicate people are in high stress conditions and people are in low stress conditions. So the black line is the low stress, and the dashed line is in the high stress. And basically, for people who are not so altruistic, when they were under a lot of stress, they had a higher probability of dying. But for the people who are altruistic, they seemed to be much more resilient to the stress, and their probability of dying did not increase with their stress. So you can see that the high and the low stress on the right graph almost overlap. So that might be one benefit of being more compassionate, is that it can actually make you more resilient to stress, which is not so surprising. I mean, that's really also what it says in the teachings, but it's interesting that there's now some empirical evidence for that as well. And it's also associated, the amount of altruism is associated with more brain cells in this other brain area, the TPJ, temporal-parietal junction, which is somewhere here, or, well, you see it there. It's basically an area that's thought to be very important in empathy. So you can see it light up. At least it's more active when people are involved in thinking about other people's state of mind compared to when they're just thinking about other things, doing reasoning about other things. And it seems to be the case that people who are more altruistic actually have more brain cells in that area, or more active, that area. So that's the end of my story. So I've just shown you that meditation influences attention and working memory, which is not so surprising given that the instructions we get for meditating are basically telling us to pay attention. It also seems to make emotions less overpowering. It decreases our sort of mental stickiness. It seems to affect the immunity system, but also changes our brain structure and function. And sometimes those changes seem to be interrelated. So the immunity system or the emotional, cognitive changes seem to be correlated with the changes in brain structure. And finally, I've shown you that compassion is good for you. It's if this is at least a causal relationship, then compassion might make you live longer. So that's it. So, questions? Yeah, any?
Mag ik het in het Nederlands vragen of zullen we het in het Engels doen?
In het Engels, ja.
Okay. Is there any way to interpret the differences in all these various research you've shown? We see differences in the control group and the meditation group. Mm-hmm. And I was curious, these differences are sometimes very small. Mm-hmm. And is there any way to estimate how big an effect it is? For instance, would I get the same results or the same differences if I let people play the violin or something like that? Or is there any way of judging these differences?
That's a very good question. I think there are many aspects to it. One is that at this point we are not so good at having what's called active controls, which would be rather than having people just do nothing, basically, for that period of time, having them do something else that they believe would also help them. So there are a few studies that do that, and they can, of course, say more specific things. And then they do show effects as well. So compared to, following health education training or following something. So there are some studies of that, although these ones did not, so it's hard to say. The other aspect is that the benefits of meditation might depend a lot on the individual's makeup. So for some people it may have a lot of effects. For other people it does not. And so also some people are to study like what personality characteristics may make meditation maybe more effective or less effective. And you could imagine that for some people it's actually not good at all. And we're just starting to explore that.
I have a question about the depressed people who get more positive with the meditation. Do we know if these people were mildly depressed or moderately depressed or severely depressed?
Pretty severely depressed. They were pretty prone to relapse in that study. Yeah.
Okay, because normally they say when you are depressed severely, you should not do mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. But I don't know if that's true then.
I don't know either, but I'm not a clinician, so I don't want to make statements about that. Yeah, but I've heard actually that the main benefit of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is that it's very good for people who are who tend to relapse a lot, because that's where it does seem to have the strongest benefits. It's not as if other treatments could have, on the short term, seem to have roughly equal effects, but really mindfulness-based cognitive therapy seems to be something that prevents relapse more than the other measures.
Okay, thanks.
Hello. My question is about how long the effects of meditation will stay in somebody. Let's say Rinpoche kept prison in China for 20 years, went through it quite happily, and after they were released, they were absolutely happy and capable of doing their job as Rinpoche again. How long would you have to stay in meditation before your happiness will be that persistent?
Yeah.
Or do you just have to be enlightened?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is a very complicated question, and science is, well, of course, this whole science of meditation is itself very young. I would say probably maybe 10 years old or so. So obviously we don't know too much about it yet, and the benefits are probably also dose dependent. So you could imagine that you can detect some benefits of meditation even after an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction course. But I would guess that those benefits are much more fleeting than the benefits that you see, after meditating maybe for 10 years or 10,000 hours. Like the one benefit, well, we saw that was from a cross-sectional study, but those people who meditated for a long time, their brain actually was different. So that might be longer, but of course we are not sure because we haven't actually tracked them from, the time they were very young, which is very difficult to do. It's very costly. So the short answer is we have no idea.
How big were the groups, the research and the control groups?
It depends, yeah.
Different researches you showed.
I would say probably mostly you'd have between 10 and 30 participants on a group. Yeah. Yeah.
And do you know if any of these researches were repeated?
So the next question is whether studies were repeated. This one thing, I think most of the ones I discussed have not been repeated. I know one for sure has been repeated, the one about attentional orienting, bringing your attention to a particular place. That one has been replicated in a different population. So, yeah.
Yeah. In the summary, it says changes in brain structure and function.
Yeah.
That is very interesting. Well, it's the opposite to what Dick Swaap says in Wij zijn ons brein. How much time does it take to change a brain structure? And structure and function, is it at the same time?
No. You would say that you can already get changes in the way you process information. That would be some aspect of brain function, even after a mindfulness induction, which is just, telling people to pay attention in a mindful way. You just give them that instruction, and even then, already people seem to be using their brains differently. However, that just happens at that point in time, and I would guess that has no implications for the structure of your brain. There have been some findings of changes in brain structure after an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction course. However, I would imagine that also that one does not persist for a very long time. I don't know how long it would persist, but the more you're doing other things, your brain adapts. So I think that is at this point clear, and I think that's, maybe not the same, not in agreement with the message by Dick Swaap. But even Dick Swaap also says that, your environment shapes your brain. So in that sense, the title is more suggestive than the actual message. The message is a little bit more nuanced. Yeah.
So Marika, if you could do your most favorite research, what is the next step? What would be wonderful to do?
Well, one thing that I'm going to be working on, hopefully over the next few years, if I get the money, is to study more this idea of our mental stickiness. Like, how do we get stuck in our negative emotions and our stories, and what does this look like in the brain, and how could that be involved in generating depression and anxiety, and how could maybe meditation decrease that stickiness and then actually bring us to more flourishing, to sort of figure out how that works on a cognitive level. I'm going to be spending 2 months this summer developing a cognitive model of meditation so that we have some better theories of that, and then seeing how that plays out in the brain and how it might be involved in generating these diseases. That's sort of really what I think is the most important thing to do, at least that I want to do. So, but there's obviously tons of things to be done. And one other interesting thing is actually studying contemplation, which is not on the map right now of meditation research. But I think obviously it also has a lot of interesting benefits. So.
Yeah, I might also have a suggestion for your next research project. I work in education in the secondary school, and so when you talk about attention and working memory, those terms are very applicable. And nowadays there are many children that are diagnosed with attention deficit disorders, like ADHD. And I was wondering if there is any research on that and the effect on people with those disorders, if they do like a mindfulness course or something like that?
Yeah, I know that it exists for sure, and I cannot reliably give you the outcomes because I'm not entirely sure. So I think it depends a little bit. It's not as clear, the benefits, because as you can imagine, it might be a really, really difficult thing to do for people with ADHD to meditate. So then obviously the benefits are also going to be dependent on that. But, yeah. Yeah.
I don't know where the borders are of science, but since Jill Boulter-Taylor's experience, could you be yourself also part of the experiment so that you can write your memoirs? from both sides?
Well, I guess in some sense, I am part of the experiment in the sense that I do let my experiments be involved by my own informed by my own experiments. I have even measured at some point my brain waves while I was meditating, but I couldn't make much sense of it. So, yeah, I mostly study other people, but obviously any studies that I do are involved by my own informed by my own experience that I use as a basis for generating hypotheses. So, and that's actually the exciting part of being this kind of a scientist. I've been involved in the Mind and Life summer research institutes, which are like mind and life discussions between scientists and Buddhists mostly, or practitioners, about how we can study this kind of a thing. And there has been some new generation that's doing both. That's both a practitioner and a scientist, and we call it the new breed. And I think that's really trying to develop both the contemplative side and the scientific side. I think it is really important and really informative. It's like a new kind of science also that combines these perspectives. Yeah.
Do you know if there are studies also, because now we are talking mostly of meditation, mindfulness meditation, but are there any studies into the effects of religious meditation, like prayer?
Prayer. I think there are. I've seen it come by. I don't remember the results. So we've even at the Mind and Life Summer Research Institute, we've talked a little bit about centering prayer, which is a Christian type of prayer that, in a way, looks quite a bit like Guru Yoga in our tradition. Is inspired by that, in fact. But at this point, there have been very few studies of that. So I think they are there, but not so many. Because of the sometimes, hesitation of the scientists to even talk about religion. So it's also a cultural issue. So, yeah.